Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daniel Rosenthal. Thank you all for coming this evening for this platform on 100 Shakespeare films. Now, we've only got 45 minutes. I'm not going to try and outdo the reduced Shakespeare company and give you all 100 in just that time. But what I would like to do is give a representative sample of a number of Shakespeare films, and particularly to look at the idea of the distinction in the history of Shakespearean cinema between original text films and genre adaptation. A distinction which means that the original text films use Shakespeare's dialogue as their screenplay, whereas the genre adaptations almost say, great story, great characters, shame about the dialogue. We'll write our own. We will rewrite, we will change the setting, we'll keep these wonderful characters, wonderful storylines that have captivated audiences for hundreds of years all over the world, and we will mould them to the conventions of mainstream film genres. There have been Shakespearean gangster thrillers, there have been Shakespearean teen comedies, there have been Shakespearean westerns, Shakespearean musicals, most famously West Side Story. So what I'd like to do this evening is just to look at a number of those as a way of illustrating the pitfalls and the more rewarding elements of this kind of adaptation. And that kind of adaptation, that kind of treatment of Shakespeare's plays really has its origin in a commercial imperative as much as an artistic one. If we go right back to the beginning of the sound era, the late 1920s, when Hollywood first attempted to film Shakespeare's plays with his language, what we find is an enormous amount of money and star power being thrown at the adaptation of the plays. In 1929, Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, the Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie of their day, playing in The Taming of the Shrew as Petruchio and Catherine. And it was a really burlesque kind of adaptation. It used the original language, but very little of it. It ran just over an hour. And it didn't make money. It was hugely expensive, but it lost a lot of money. And the same thing happened again in 1935 and 1936 with the Warner Brothers and MGM films of A Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet. There was great prestige attached to them, Oscar nominations, but the box office figures weren't good enough. And Variety, the trade bible then as now for Hollywood filmmaking, concluded that the point of making Shakespearean cinema was much more in the accumulation of kudos for the production company than for box office receipts. And it's pretty much been the case ever since. Yes, there are exceptions. There are original text Shakespeare films such as Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing, which we're going to look at this evening, and especially Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, films that retain the language and become international box office successes. But they really are, out of the hundreds and hundreds of Shakespearean films, these are the exceptions proving the rule. And his language, his greatest glory when we see productions such as Nick Heitner's Much Ado, which I imagine many of you are going to see this evening. Shakespeare's language, his greatest glory on the page, on the stage, and on screen, is also his greatest liability. Too many of us, if we're thinking of a night out at the cinema, don't associate a good night at the Odeon with Shakespeare. There's too strong an association with how we might have experienced it at school, and the language barrier is absolutely there, because one's expectation of a night at the cinema is very different from one's expectation of a night at the theatre to see Shakespeare. We don't, when we go and see a mainstream film, expect to have to concentrate as hard on the dialogue as we would with a contemporary screenplay. Even, I would argue, with historical drama such as Elizabeth or something as literate as Shakespeare in Love, you don't, in a sense, need a glossary by your side to understand every line of dialogue in those films, in a way that going to see Olivier's Hamlet or Branagh's Hamlet even those of us familiar with the plays, there will still be those occasional lines where perhaps you haven't quite grasped all of the meaning. And it's simple commercial logic that if there is the choice between going to see and hear a new film version of Othello and going to see a new high school drama based on Othello, as happened with Tim Blake Nelson's film O, which we'll look at this evening, there will be more people who want to see the latter than the former. And the box office figures, both individually and collectively, bear this out. The Oliver Parker film of Othello from 1995 with Kenneth Branagh and Lawrence Fishburne took around $4 million at the US box office. O took 16 million. So there's a simple fourfold difference there with just one example of taking a Shakespeare play and comparing the box office results for an original text adaptation with what happens with the genre film. What's so extraordinary when you look through a number of these genre adaptations is to see how successfully it can work. And I hope this evening's clips will illustrate that. But you have to choose carefully. You have to choose the right marriage of Shakespeare play and commercial film genre. And if you don't, and if you take the play out of its original context and put it in the wrong new period and the wrong new location, then the result artistically can be disastrous. And the first example that we're going to look at this evening is, in honour of the Nick Heitner production, Much Ado About Nothing. Now, Branagh's film was not the